Harlem in the early 1930s was a place where music floated through the streets long after midnight, where laughter spilled from crowded jazz clubs, and where hope and hardship lived side by side like neighbors who had learned to tolerate each other. Street lamps glowed softly over Lenox Avenue while taxi horns echoed in the distance, and the warm hum of conversation poured from cafes where people gathered to forget, if only for a few hours, the weight of the world outside. But beneath that music and movement, Harlem carried something deeper, a quiet dignity, a sense of pride that refused to be broken, even in a time when many people believed it should be. And among the many figures who walked those streets, one man moved through Harlem with a calm presence that people recognized instantly. Bumpy Johnson. He was not the loudest man in any room. He did not need to be. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were measured and thoughtful, as if every sentence had already been tested in his mind before leaving his lips. His suits were always clean and simple, his posture upright, and his gaze steady in a way that made people feel both respected and understood. To the outside world, people tried to describe him in simple terms: powerful, influential, feared. But Harlem knew something different. They knew Bumpy Johnson as a man who believed that power meant responsibility, and that belief shaped everything he did. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Bumpy sat near the back corner of a small jazz club on 135th Street. The room was alive with music, the trumpet player leaning into a slow, soulful melody while couples danced beneath soft golden lights. Cigarette smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling, and glasses clinked gently as waiters moved between tables. Bumpy listened carefully to the music, not just the sound of it, but the feeling behind it. Across from him sat Elijah Carter, an older man who had known Bumpy since his earliest days in Harlem. Elijah was the kind of person who spoke plainly, someone whose honesty carried the weight of experience. Elijah leaned slightly closer across the table. "They're pushing again," he said quietly. Bumpy did not immediately respond. Instead, he took a slow sip from the glass in front of him and looked toward the stage, where the band continued playing. "I know," he finally said. Elijah's expression tightened. "The neighborhood's uneasy," Elijah continued. "People are hearing things." That was the problem with Harlem in those days. News traveled faster than any newspaper could print it. Word moved through barber shops, grocery stores, church steps, and crowded sidewalks. Stories changed slightly with each telling, but the meaning beneath them remained clear, and lately, the meaning had become troubling. A powerful figure from downtown had begun sending men north into Harlem more frequently. Schultz. Schultz was known throughout New York for his aggressive ambitions. He was a man who believed territory could be taken simply by showing up and declaring it his own. His reputation had been built on intimidation, and many neighborhoods had already learned how difficult it was to resist that kind of pressure. But Harlem was not just another neighborhood. It was a community that had fought too long and too hard to maintain its dignity, and Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. Elijah studied Bumpy carefully. "They're saying Schultz wants to run Harlem," Elijah said. Bumpy finally looked up. His expression remained calm. "Harlem runs itself," he replied. Elijah nodded slowly, though the worry in his eyes did not disappear. The band finished its song, and applause rolled through the room like distant thunder. The musicians smiled modestly before beginning another melody, softer this time. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again, but that peace did not last. The club doors opened suddenly. Cold air rushed into the room, carrying the sound of heavy footsteps across the wooden floor. Conversations faded as people turned toward the entrance. 5 men had stepped inside. Their coats were long and dark, their expressions serious, and their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. People recognized them quickly, not by name, but by the feeling they brought with them. They were not from Harlem, and they were not there to enjoy the music. One of the men scanned the room until his eyes landed on Bumpy Johnson. He smiled faintly. Group began walking toward the back of the club. At nearby tables, people quietly shifted their chairs, creating space as the men passed. No one spoke. No one needed to. By the time they reached Bumpy's table, the entire club had grown silent except for the band, which continued playing softly as if pretending nothing unusual had happened. The man leading the group stopped a few feet away. "You Bumpy Johnson?" he asked. Bumpy leaned back slightly in his chair. "Yes," he said calmly. The man nodded once. "My boss wants to talk business." Bumpy studied him for a moment. "Your boss has a name," he replied. The man smirked. "Dutch Schultz." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Elijah shifted slightly in his seat, but Bumpy remained still. "And what business does Mr. Schultz believe he has in Harlem?" Bumpy asked. The man placed both hands in his coat pockets. "He believes Harlem could benefit from new management." A few people in the room quietly exhaled. The words were not shouted, but the meaning behind them was clear. Bumpy Johnson remained silent for several seconds. Then he stood slowly. He was not a tall man, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made him seem larger than the room itself. He looked directly at the man. "Harlem is not a business," Bumpy said. The man shrugged slightly. "Everything's a business." Bumpy shook his head once. "No," he said softly. He stepped a little closer. "Some things are communities." The man's smile faded. Around them, the club had gone completely quiet now. Even the musicians on stage had begun to slow their playing. Sensing the tension in the room, the man studied Bumpy carefully. "Mr. Schultz believes cooperation would be beneficial," he said. "And if I don't cooperate?" Bumpy asked. The man glanced briefly at the others behind him before returning his gaze to Bumpy. "Then things might become difficult." Bumpy Johnson looked around the room. He saw familiar faces: neighbors, musicians, workers, couples enjoying a rare night of music and laughter. People who had come to forget the outside world for a while. Then he looked back at the man in front of him. "You came into this room," Bumpy said quietly, "while people were enjoying their evening." He gestured gently toward the stage. "You interrupted music." The man frowned slightly. "I'm talking about business." Bumpy nodded once. "And I'm talking about respect." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bumpy reached into his coat pocket. The room froze. But instead of pulling out anything threatening, Bumpy removed a small folded handkerchief. He calmly wiped a drop of water from the table before folding the cloth. Again, his voice remained steady. "If Mr. Schultz wants to speak with me," Bumpy said, "he can come himself." The man hesitated. "He doesn't usually travel this far." "North," he said. Bumpy smiled slightly. Then he must not want the conversation very badly. A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the room. The man's face hardened. "You're making a mistake," he said. Bumpy's expression did not change. "No," he replied. "I'm preventing one." For several long seconds, the two men simply looked at each other. Finally, the man turned. His group walked back toward the door, their footsteps echoing across the silent floor. When the door closed behind them, the band slowly resumed playing. Conversation gradually returned to the room. But everyone knew something important had just begun. Harlem had been challenged. And Bumpy Johnson had answered. Not with threats, not with anger, but with something far more powerful. Calm. And outside, somewhere beyond those glowing street lamps, Dutch Schultz was already preparing his next move. A move that would change Harlem forever. But no one yet knew that the moment which would define that story would come from a single sound. A sound that would echo across Harlem history. A gunshot. Harlem did not sleep easily after that night. The music still played in the clubs. The horns still cried through the smoky rooms. And the rhythm of drums still rolled through Lenox Avenue long after midnight. But beneath that music, something new had settled into the air. A tension. People spoke about it quietly in barbershops and bakeries, in apartment hallways and church steps. It was the kind of tension that spreads through a neighborhood before a storm arrives, when the wind changes direction and everyone senses that something important is coming. The night Dutch Schultz's men walked into that club had become the only story anyone talked about. Not because of shouting, not because of violence, but because nothing happened. Bumpy Johnson had stood in front of 5 men sent by one of the most feared figures in New York and answered them with calm words and steady eyes. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened them. He had simply refused, and that refusal had traveled through Harlem like electricity. People repeated the story, differently each time they told it, but the heart of the moment remained the same. Bumpy Johnson had not bowed his head. He had protected the dignity of Harlem, without turning the room into chaos. But while Harlem felt proud, those who understood power knew something else. Men like Dutch Schultz did not accept quiet rejection. They answered it. 3 nights after the club encounter, Harlem's streets carried a strange stillness. The air was colder than usual, the wind brushing against the brick buildings like whispered warnings. Streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalks, while shopkeepers locked their doors earlier than normal. Inside a small cafe near 138th Street, Bumpy Johnson sat at a corner table. Across from him sat Elijah Carter again, his brow slightly furrowed as he stirred a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. "They're moving," Elijah said quietly. Bumpy looked up. "How many?" he asked. Elijah leaned back slightly. "More than before." That was the troubling part. Schultz's presence in Harlem had changed over the past 2 days. At first, it had been subtle strangers appearing near storefronts, unfamiliar cars parked on corners longer than necessary, quiet men watching doorways. But by now, the pattern had become unmistakable. Dutch Schultz was sending more men into Harlem, and this time, they were not coming just to talk. Elijah rubbed his hands together slowly. "People are nervous," he said. Bumpy remained calm. "Nervous people make mistakes," he replied. "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Elijah said. For several moments, Bumpy said nothing. His gaze drifted toward the cafe window, where he watched pedestrians move along the sidewalk outside. A young boy carried a newspaper under one arm, while an elderly woman walked slowly beside him, her steps careful but determined. Life in Harlem continued. And that mattered to Bumpy Johnson more than anything else. Finally, he spoke. "Do you remember the first time you walked these streets?" he asked Elijah. Elijah looked confused. "That was 30 years ago," he said. "And what did you feel?" Bumpy asked. Elijah thought for a moment. "Hope," he answered quietly. Bumpy nodded once. "That's what we protect." Elijah understood immediately. Bumpy Johnson had never believed Harlem was something to control. To him, Harlem was something to guard, but protecting something precious often attracted attention from those who believed everything had a price. That afternoon, news arrived that confirmed everyone's fears. Dutch Schultz himself had entered Harlem. The rumor spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. People spotted him first near 7th Avenue, stepping out of a dark car with 2 men walking closely behind him. He wore an expensive overcoat and a hat pulled low over his eyes, but there was no mistaking him. Schultz carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed every room he entered already belonged to him, and Harlem noticed. Some people stepped aside as he passed. Others watched silently from doorways, but no one greeted him. Schultz walked down the street slowly, studying the neighborhood like a businessman inspecting a new investment. He stopped briefly outside a grocery store, glancing inside before continuing his walk. One of his men leaned closer. "You sure about this place?" the man asked. Schultz smiled faintly. "Every place has a price," he said, but Harlem was listening. Within minutes, word reached Bumpy Johnson. He was sitting in a quiet office above a small storefront when the message arrived. One of the neighborhood Runners, a young man barely 20 burst through the door, breathing hard. "He's here," the young man said. Bumpy looked up calmly. "Who?" The young man swallowed. "Dutch Schultz." The room fell silent. Several men standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what Schultz's presence meant. A man like that did not travel personally unless he intended to make a statement, and statements from men like Schultz were rarely peaceful. Bumpy stood slowly. He adjusted the cuffs of his coat before reaching for his hat. "Where?" he asked. "7th Avenue, the young man replied. Bumpy nodded once. "Thank you." As he walked toward the door, one of the men inside the office stepped forward. "You shouldn't go alone," he said. Bumpy paused. Then he turned slightly. "Why not?" The man hesitated. "Because Schultz doesn't come for conversations." Bumpy placed his hat on his head. Then perhaps he should learn something new today. Outside, the afternoon light had begun fading into early evening. Harlem's streets glowed under soft golden lamps while the sky above shifted toward deep purple. Bumpy Johnson walked calmly down the sidewalk. People noticed him immediately. Some nodded respectfully. Others whispered quietly as he passed. But something unusual happened as he moved through the neighborhood. The streets began filling. Not with soldiers, not with angry crowds, but with residents. Shopkeepers stepped outside their stores. Musicians paused on street corners. Families leaned from apartment windows. Word had spread quickly. Bumpy Johnson was going to meet Dutch Schultz near the intersection of 7th Avenue and 134th Street. Schultz stood beside his car, speaking casually with two of his men. He looked relaxed, almost amused, as if he were enjoying the attention Harlem was giving him. Then he noticed the crowd forming. And at the center of that quiet gathering, he saw Bumpy Johnson approaching. Schultz straightened slightly. "So that's him," he said. One of his men nodded. Bumpy walked forward calmly until he stood a few feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. The street had grown completely silent. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away. Finally, Schultz smiled. "I was wondering when we'd meet," he said. Bumpy returned a polite nod. "Mr. Schultz." Schultz studied him carefully. "You're not what I expected." Bumpy's expression remained calm. "And what did you expect?" Schultz shrugged. "Someone louder." A faint smile appeared on Bumpy's face. Loud men rarely listen. Schultz chuckled softly. "I didn't come here to listen," he said. "I came to make an offer." Bumpy waited. Schultz gestured toward the street around them. "You've built something impressive here," he said. "But running a place like this takes resources, connections, protection." He stepped slightly closer. "I can provide all of that." Bumpy considered the words. "And what would Harlem provide in return?" he asked. Schultz smiled. "Cooperation." The crowd remained silent. Bumpy Johnson glanced briefly at the people watching from doorways and sidewalks. Then he looked back at Schultz. "You misunderstand something," Bumpy said quietly. Schultz raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Bumpy gestured toward the neighborhood. "This place doesn't belong to me," Schultz laughed. "That's not how the world works." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "That's exactly how it works." Schultz's smile faded slightly. "Every neighborhood answers to someone," he said. Bumpy's voice remained calm. "Not this one." For several seconds, the two men stared at each other. The tension in the street felt almost physical now, like a wire pulled too tight. Finally, Schultz leaned closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Bumpy's eyes did not move. Respect usually is. Schultz stepped back. "All right," he said. "Let's see how long respect holds up." He turned toward his car. Before climbing inside, he looked over his shoulder one last time. "Next time we meet," Schultz said quietly, "it won't be in the street." Then the car door slammed. The engine roared to life, and Dutch Schultz drove away. The crowd remained silent. Long after the car disappeared down the avenue, Bumpy Johnson stood still for several moments. Elijah eventually stepped beside him. "That didn't settle anything," Elijah said quietly. Bumpy watched the empty street. "No," he agreed. Then he spoke a sentence that only a few people nearby could hear, but it started something. And somewhere across the city, Dutch Schultz was already planning his answer. An answer that would arrive with 12 men. An answer that would bring Harlem to the edge of violence, and an answer that would end with a single moment. A moment where a gun would fire, and a sound would echo through Harlem that no one would ever forget. Harlem had learned something important about silence. Sometimes silence meant peace, but sometimes silence meant people were waiting. 2 nights had passed since the meeting on 7th Avenue, and although the streets looked normal to outsiders, the people who lived there could feel the difference in the air. Conversations were shorter. Eyes moved more carefully across crowded sidewalks. Even the music in the clubs carried a slightly different rhythm, still beautiful, still powerful, but edged with something heavier. Anticipation. Because Harlem knew. Dutch Schultz had not come north simply to exchange polite words. Men like Schultz believed power was proven through fear, and Harlem had refused to show any, and that refusal had unsettled him. Inside a modest office above a tailor shop, Bumpy Johnson sat at a wooden desk near the window. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated stacks of papers and a single open notebook where Bumpy occasionally wrote thoughts that few people ever saw. Across the room stood 3 men who had been quietly gathering information for him over the past day. Their expressions were serious. "Schultz met with people downtown last night," one of them said. Bumpy looked up slowly. "How many?" he asked. "More than usual." Another man stepped forward. "And they're angry." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "Anger is loud," he said calmly, "but it rarely lasts." The man shook his head slightly. "This anger is different." That was what troubled them. Dutch Schultz had built his reputation on confidence, but Harlem's refusal to bend had shaken that confidence more than anyone expected. Schultz had walked into a neighborhood where intimidation normally worked and discovered something unusual. People there were not afraid, they were patient, and patience often frustrated powerful men. Bumpy closed the notebook in front of him. "Where are they now?" he asked. The first man hesitated before answering. "Moving north again." The room grew quiet. Bumpy stood slowly, adjusting his coat with the same calm precision he showed in every situation. "How many?" he asked again. 12. The number hung in the air like a warning bell. 12 men meant something very specific in Schultz's world. It meant he was no longer trying to negotiate. It meant he was trying to make a point. Outside, Harlem moved through another evening of music and light. Neon signs flickered above club doors, while laughter drifted into the streets. Taxis rolled past slowly, their headlights cutting through the dim glow of street lamps. But behind that familiar rhythm, people were watching. Word had already spread that Schultz's men were moving again, and they were heading toward the same club where everything had started. Inside that club, the atmosphere felt different tonight. The trumpet player stood near the stage, warming up his instrument, while the pianist tested a few quiet chords. Couples filled the dance floor, but their movements were slower than usual, their attention drifting toward the door more often than the music deserved. Near the back of the room, Bumpy Johnson sat at a table beside Elijah Carter. Elijah looked uneasy. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Bumpy nodded once. "Very." Elijah leaned closer. "They're coming here to provoke something, perhaps," Bumpy said. "And if they succeed?" Elijah asked. Bumpy's expression remained calm. "Then we fail." That was the difference between Bumpy Johnson and the men who opposed him. He did not measure strength by how quickly someone could start a fight. He measured it by how long someone could avoid one. A few feet away stood Marcus Reed, Bumpy's longtime bodyguard. Marcus was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose presence alone made people think twice before causing trouble. But those who knew him understood something deeper about him. Marcus Reed moved only when necessary. And when he did, he moved fast. The club doors opened suddenly. Cold air swept into the room. The music stopped instantly. Every head turned toward the entrance. 12 men walked inside. Their footsteps echoed across the wooden floor with deliberate confidence, their long coats brushing against the tables as they moved through the crowd. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply walked. The same man who had confronted Bumpy earlier in the week stepped forward again, his expression tighter now, his confidence slightly forced. The band remained frozen on stage. The dancers slowly stepped away from the floor. The entire club had fallen silent. The man stopped a few feet from Bumpy's table. "Well," he said, glancing around the room. "Looks like we found you again." Bumpy lifted his eyes calmly. "Yes," he replied. The man folded his arms. "My boss is tired of talking." Bumpy gestured politely toward the empty chair across from him. "You're welcome to sit." The man did not sit. "I'm not here for conversation." Bumpy nodded. "That's unfortunate." Behind the man, the other 11 figures spread across the room slightly, positioning themselves in ways that made the intention clear. They had not come for music. They had come to show power. The leader leaned closer to Bumpy. "You had your chance," he said. Bumpy remained still. "And now?" he asked. The man smiled thinly. "Now things change." He reached slowly inside his coat. Several people in the club gasped quietly. Marcus Reed's posture shifted instantly, his attention locking onto the man's hand. The pistol appeared quickly. The barrel lifted toward Bumpy Johnson. Time seemed to stretch into slow motion. In the corner of the room, someone whispered a prayer. On stage, the trumpet player froze completely, and for a brief moment, Harlem held its breath. Then a single sound shattered the air. Crack! The gunshot exploded through the club like thunder. But it had not come from the pistol pointed at Bumpy Johnson. Marcus Reed had already moved. His shot struck the hanging lamp above the bar, shattering the glass with a violent burst of sparks and darkness. The sudden explosion of broken light plunged half the room into shadow as fragments rained down across the counter. The man with the pistol flinched violently. His weapon slipped from his grip, clattering across the floor. No one else moved. The silence that followed felt even louder than the gunshot itself. Slowly, Bumpy Johnson stood. He brushed a piece of dust from his sleeve before stepping forward into the dim light. The 12 men looked uncertain now, not because of the gun, but because of what had just happened. Marcus Reed had not aimed at them. He had not harmed anyone. He had simply changed the room. Bumpy looked calmly at the man who had dropped the pistol. "Do you know why he fired?" Bumpy asked. The man said nothing. Bumpy glanced briefly toward the shattered lamp above the bar. "That light was bright," Bumpy said quietly. He stepped closer. "Sometimes people mistake brightness for power." The man swallowed nervously. Bumpy continued, "But real power." He paused, letting the silence settle around them. "Is knowing exactly when to turn the lights off." No one in the club moved. The message was clear. Marcus Reed had fired one shot, and that one shot had completely changed the balance of the room. Bumpy gestured gently toward the door. "You came to make a point," he said softly. Then he nodded toward the exit. "Now you can leave with one." For several long seconds, the 12 men stood frozen. Then something unexpected happened. The leader bent slowly and picked up the pistol from the floor. He looked at it, then at Bumpy Johnson. Finally, he placed the gun back inside his coat. Without another word, he turned toward the door. One by one, the others followed him out of the club. The door closed behind them, and the room remained silent. Elijah exhaled slowly. Well, he said. Bumpy sat down again. The band on stage looked toward him uncertainly. Bumpy nodded politely. Please, he said. Continue the music. The trumpet player lifted his instrument again. And as the first soft note filled the room, the people of Harlem understood something important. A war had almost begun that night. But it had been stopped. Not by force, not by violence, but by a single sound. A sound that reminded everyone in that room that respect could still be louder than fear. The night after the gunshot, Harlem did not explode into chaos. It became quieter. Not the peaceful quiet that comes after a long day, when the streets finally rest and the city exhales. This was a different kind of quiet, one that moved carefully through the neighborhood like a secret being passed from one person to another. People spoke about what had happened in low voices. They spoke about the moment the 12 men walked into the club. They spoke about the pistol raised across the room. But most of all, they spoke about what didn't happen. No one had been hurt. No fight had erupted. And the men who came to intimidate Harlem had walked out the door with their heads lowered and their voices gone. That was the part people could not stop talking about, because Harlem had seen violence before. It had seen shouting, anger, and reckless decisions that left entire streets scarred with regret. But this was something else. This was control. And control carried a different kind of power. The story spread through the neighborhood quickly. Barbers repeated it to customers sitting in their chairs. Grocery store owners leaned across counters to whisper it to familiar faces. Musicians talked about it between sets in the clubs. Every version ended the same way. A gunshot, a shattered light, and Bumpy Johnson standing calmly in the darkness, speaking softly while 12 men who came for domination walked away without saying another word. But while Harlem absorbed the moment with quiet pride, another part of the city was reacting very differently. Downtown, inside a private office where the lights stayed on long after midnight, Dutch Schultz sat behind a polished desk listening to the same story. Except this version carried a different tone. The man standing across from him was one of the 12 who had walked into the club. His coat was still wrinkled from the long night. His voice carried frustration. "He embarrassed us," the man said. Schultz remained silent for a long moment. He was a man who rarely allowed his emotions to show, but tonight his expression was unusually tight. The events in Harlem had traveled through the city quickly, and the story had reached ears Schultz did not like disappointing. "You went there with 12 men," Schultz said quietly. "Yes." "And you walked out," the man swallowed. "Yes." Schultz leaned back slowly in his chair. "That's an interesting story." The man shifted his weight. "He had people there." Schultz smiled slightly. "Of course he did." For a moment, the room felt heavy. Then Schultz stood. He walked slowly toward the window, overlooking the city streets below. Cars moved through the darkness like tiny glowing insects, while distant horns echoed against the buildings. "Tell me something," Schultz said calmly. The man waited. When the shot was fired, he turned slightly. "Who fired first?" The man hesitated. "His bodyguard." Schultz nodded once. "And who did he shoot?" The man frowned. "No one." That was the detail that interested Schultz the most. He turned back toward the desk, resting his hands on the polished wood. "Why?" Schultz asked. The man had no answer. Because that was the strange part. The bodyguard had fired with perfect aim. He could have shot anyone in that room. Instead, he had shattered a lamp. And that single choice had taken control of the moment. Schultz slowly sat down again. "Do you know what that means?" he asked quietly. The man shook his head. "It means Bumpy Johnson understands something most men don't." Schultz folded his hands together. "It means he knows when not to pull the trigger." The room went silent. For the first time that night, Schultz smiled not with anger, but with a kind of reluctant respect. Interesting, he murmured. Back in Harlem, the following evening arrived with a different atmosphere. The tension that had filled the neighborhood for days was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. Street vendors reopened their stands. Children returned to playing along the sidewalks. The jazz clubs lit their signs again, welcoming people back inside with warm music and laughter. But one place remained the center of every conversation. The same club where the gunshot had echoed. Inside that club, the band was already playing when Bumpy Johnson entered. The musicians noticed him first, then the crowd. A ripple of quiet recognition moved through the room as people watched him walk toward the same table he always chose near the back corner. Bumpy nodded politely to a few familiar faces before sitting down. Elijah Carter arrived moments later, lowering himself into the chair across from him. "You've become famous again," Elijah said with a small smile. Bumpy poured himself a glass of water. "Fame fades," he replied calmly. Elijah leaned closer. "Maybe," he said. "But respect stays." For a moment, the two men listened to the music drifting across the room. The trumpet player was performing a slow melody tonight, one that carried a deep emotional weight through every note. Finally, Elijah spoke again. "Do you think Schultz will come back?" he asked. Bumpy considered the question. Then he looked around the room. He saw couples laughing near the stage. He saw musicians smiling as they played. He saw neighbors who had lived side by side for years, enjoying a simple night of peace. Then he answered quietly, "No." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" Bumpy nodded. "Yes. Why?" Bumpy rested his hands calmly on the table. "Because Schultz is a businessman," Elijah frowned. And businessmen understand profit." Bumpy gestured gently toward the room. What happened here wasn't profitable. Elijah thought about that. Slowly, he began to understand. If Schultz returned with violence now, he would risk turning Harlem completely against him. The story of the 12 men walking out quietly had already spread too far. Coming back with anger would only make Bumpy Johnson stronger. It would make Harlem stronger. And Schultz was not the kind of man who liked losing business. Across the room, the trumpet player finished his song. Applause filled the club. Bumpy looked toward the stage and clapped politely with everyone else. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You know what people will remember about that night?" Elijah asked. Bumpy smiled slightly. "The gunshot." Elijah shook his head. "No." He pointed gently toward the stage lights glowing above the musicians. "They'll remember the silence after it." Bumpy considered that for a moment. Then he nodded. Because Elijah was right. The sound that changed Harlem that night had not been the gunshot. It had been the moment that followed. The moment when 12 men who came to control a neighborhood realized they had already lost something more powerful, respect. And as the music filled the club once more, Harlem understood something that would echo through its streets for years to come. True power was never proven by who pulled the trigger. True power was proven by who didn't need to.